Welcome to the Movidiam podcast. Join the conversation with global innovators as they share their journeys, discuss the state of the industry, and share insight into the future of media for brands, agencies, and production companies.
Hello and welcome to the Movidiam Creators Leaders podcast. Today I'm delighted to welcome Ryan Goodman. Ryan is represented by Movidiam Talent and is a very inspiring director. Ryan, welcome to Movidiam podcast.
Thank you very much.
Ryan, let's talk a little bit about your background and kind of how did you decide to get into the wonderful world of directing and creative work in general?
Well, from school I was never really creative. I was very much kind of not interested in art or anything like that, and it wasn't until I went out into the working world, decided pension administration wasn't for me, and went and did filmmaking BTEC and found photography, followed that right through to university. I went to Newport in Wales to do documentary photography, and then I came out of there and people weren't really paying for my photographs, but I made a couple of short films locally around my town, and one of those actually got picked up. It was about the rugby club. Got picked up by an ex-player who ran a studio in London called Studio Juice, a guy named Ross Sterling, and they kind of took a punt on me. If I'm honest, he kind of got me in to do a charity gig kind of film for him that he puts on every year. And then from there, the next thing I got was a call saying, do you want to come and film a band in London with us? I didn't have a clue who it was, and I turned up on set to do some stop motion time-lapse recording, and it was Mumford & Sons. So I took a second camera with me.
Gave him a quick Google.
Yeah, gave him a quick Google. Hadn't heard of them much, but they were on their second album, and it was they were shooting the front cover for Babel, and luckily I had two cameras on me, and I used one for time lapse, and then I kind of made a bit more of a live action of the day. They're all their friends there, basically. It's the front cover of Babel, so if you take a look at that, it's got kind of a big crowd of people, and there were some amazing directors, actually, Fred and Nick in the crowd, so I was a bit nervous filming with them, but yeah, no.
We'll have to have the backing track to this podcast, maybe a bit of Mumford & Sons if we're able to.
I mean, I'm not sure if we've got the money for the license.
well, there's always a few license agreements we can come up with. We've got quite a big network these days. After that, the progress into actually working with some clothing brands, and I know that you actually historically have been at Superdry, which is a very interesting sort of fast-moving business. Perhaps you can talk about your interest or how you tell narrative stories for businesses like that.
Well, Superdry was an interesting one. I had kind of done music videos for a while and was told by a rep that I really needed some commercial work on my reel, and so I looked for opportunities that would present that. Superdry kind of came up as not something I expected to do with my career, go and work in-house for a major fashion brand. It wasn't what I was expecting to do, but at the time it came up, it was the perfect opportunity. Telling narratives for Superdry was interesting because they really were in a process of change when I joined them, and the video team especially, they'd gone out of house with a lot of their work. So it was bringing a lot of new ideas into everyday thinking for them, kind of trying to make their in-house work a bit more contemporary. And it was difficult, if I'm honest. Telling a narrative was always at the heart of everything that I wanted to do, but some of my work from Superdry kind of loosely adheres to that. And then,
well, it's quite difficult, isn't it, when you've got a sort of brand? There's a lot of stakeholders at a brand, and it's difficult, can you sort of go too deep into the narrative element? Is that staying on brand? And then there's lots of different elements to it aside from just doing product work and product shots, which is quite good for pack work, but it's quite challenging otherwise.
Yeah, it was a really weird one. Superdry were in a real state of flux. 1 second, sorry, someone's just coming in.
Well, that's awesome. Do they want to join? Do you want to join the show?
Just give us a second one. Sorry. So Superdry in particular was going through a real big change when I joined. They actually changed ownership twice in the time I was with them. So where you're saying about competing views on stakeholders, it was whole kind of different ideas as to what the brand should be doing.
It's quite difficult for a filmmaker to kind of keep up with that if it's a long gestation period for projects, or actually what I find, certainly speaking to agency in-house producers and teams and creatives, is they want to be producing and making more often, and actually perhaps have less affinity or attention to the actual brand, but just tell good stories authentically.
Yeah, well, the great thing was that we did get a couple of projects to really kind of fly with Superdry, and we increased their video output, I think 200%, I think was the statistic. And then we did some great work with the Invictus Games, which I'd say was our biggest success. It kind of doubled our engagement rates, and that was a real example of actually coming up with a narrative concept to go through it. It was more of a documentary piece than a fashion piece, but with that, because I had such a close affinity with kind of military family anyway, I was really interested in the subject matter. I didn't really think I'd get to do it at Superdry either, but we got to go and spend time with the competitors. We got to spend a lot of time with competitors and make a story about their journey. But even that met with a lot of kind of competing ideas about what the business wanted to get out of Invictus and kind of their partnership with these competitors. So yeah, it's difficult sometimes to tell the narratives that you want to tell, but of course you're always competing with what's best for the business and what the business needs to say for itself. Yeah,
sure. And what does the perfect brief look like for you? I mean, where are you at now?
What does the perfect brief look like? Oh man, that's the sign over the keys to the city, I guess, would be the perfect brief. I learned a lot about kind of working with clients, and to be honest, when you're going into the commercial world, it was the best place for me, because it did teach me a lot about how to work with clients and what their demands will be, both on set and in kind of pre-production and with briefs. And I think it's not the best brief, I guess it's the best client is someone who's open to ideas and open to listen to kind of your expertise, because I mean, a brief is kind of given out when the marketing department or whoever comes up with what they want to achieve. And I think what's best is when you have a client that listens to what your ideas are, so that you can kind of bridge the gap between the creative and the kind of marketing. And I think they're very different things, but very different ideas about how to get to the same place. And I think what you've got to do is really kind of listen closely and pull out the key points from any brief, so that you can achieve those marketing goals. But then equally, like with analytics and stuff like that, you can't get too lost in kind of, well, this is exactly what we should be making because the analytics point to that. Because if throughout history, like, of advertising, the best moments, the best adverts, or the best kind of content all comes from that little bit of originality that goes with matching the brief and matching the marketing aims, if you see what I mean.
Well, it's the sort of holy trinity, isn't it? There's a perfect storm, and that's why something runs and something doesn't. And I think all the data in the world doesn't get you to a point of where where the public consciousness is at.
Yeah, and I think you have to be reactive sometimes. A lot of things that I pushed for when I was in-house were kind of, oh look, something's happening in the real world, we should latch on and make a point. Sometimes it was a little bit too out there. I remember pitching an idea that was around the time Superdry was very much run by people who wanted to remain, and we were having our winter kind of jackets advert come out, and I wanted to use remain warm, remain this, remain that, and like really push that we had that. And it was a bit too much of a risk for Superdry, who were trying to be a bit broader maybe with their target demographic. But I thought it was such a great idea, because all of the analytics point to, you would say remain and people will get on board with the cause, whereas people who are upset by the cause tend to come back to the brand anyway. You gain more of a positive impact from striking a chord with people, and then the people that get upset tend to, because of their shopping habits, come back anyway. It was a bit too much out there for Superdry at the time, but it was that kind of thinking that I thought really would push things forward. Yeah.
And what do you make of all the sort of new platforms that filmmakers have to kind of, respect, whether they adhere to them or use them or not? The Instagram stories, the Snapchats, the other platforms where brands are trying to communicate with moving image.
In the early part of my career, I was very dismissive. I was very much like, no, everything should be in 16:9 and should, this 9:16 revolution that we're having for smartphones was what really got my back up. And, I went to a lot of this was in-house at Superdry again, that I was taken to YouTube and they were telling me that, your videos have to be exactly made like this in this structure with a title within 3 seconds. Your first image has to really hit home. I didn't feel like that. I felt like, again, creativity was the best thing. The biggest hook for people is that, yes, they're captured quickly, but also that they're always interested, and that can actually be a slow start to something, can capture people's interest as much as a big burst of images or something like that. But in terms of the new formats, I've really grown into them. Through Superdry we had to shoot everything, and it changed the way I was making content as well, because I always knew from the minute I walked in at Superdry that I had to service for our social channels and stuff like that. So I didn't like the idea of just repurposing what we shot for our main advert to be used again and again and again in all our different social channels. And, it wasn't shot for a 9:16 format. So what I like to do was build into the pre-production process all of these extra kind of elements that would give us a social video or a social set of content.
Just sticking around and playing around on these tools, and I think playing around with them is what people need to do to kind of understand them. I have seen some remarkable creativity on the Instagrams and Snapchats, and it's because when people sort of jar you by playing with the actual format itself. I mean, I don't think creativity stops just because something's changed shape.
No, not at all. And I think, in fact, my original skepticism about it was kind of just coming from wanting to be a pure filmmaker rather than wanting to kind of necessarily, in my early career, go into commercial. I was working in music videos and stuff like that, so we weren't creating a lot in different formats. But
well, I think change is always uncomfortable. Actually, if I'm being honest, I think change is uncomfortable, and people like consistency and similarity. And I think with a 16:9 film, we all been to cinema, we know that feeling. And suddenly this change comes along, and I think sometimes one needs to substitute the word change for growth.
Yeah, and I think the best thing about kind of what I've learned from the social is that, just taking a step back, I just wanted to say that my biggest thing about it was being told that this is what you had to do and this is how you had to do things. And I didn't like kind of necessarily someone kind of trying to sell me this was exactly how I do my job that I'd been doing for, by this point, 8 years. So you're right, it is growth, and it was growth for me as well, because we did do some great social things. By the time I left Superdry, we had put everything in place for the in-house team to go forward and make great stuff. And one of my proudest things is looking at the social content and looking at the social feeds, is seeing what the base that we put in place, especially at a brand like Superdry, whose social content pre-film team that they put in place that I was kind of leading at the time, now their social content actually follows on from the seeds that we had put in place when I was there. And I'm really kind of proud of the team that I left behind, and seeing the social work that they do is really inventive, and we work on that as a team.
That's a good feeling. I get it. I mean, and on to that point, what do you think is the sort of super optimum setup for a brand wanting to do well with video? Is it to have a producer in-house and then bring in inspired directing talent on a weekly or monthly basis, or is it to have directing talent actually sit there, or a kind of run and gun predator, shooter, editor, director, or in-house? I mean, obviously there's a kind of cost question, which is why they appear and want to have stuff in-house, but then there's a sort of inspiration, quality, and do the very best creative minds want to be specifically tied to the mast inside a brand?
It depends where the brand itself is. I think some have already got some really well established kind of creative goals, and then have people in positions that are really pushing the right creative. So for them, maybe because they've got someone or an in-house team that are coming up with ideas, or that they've got such an identity that they can kind of bring someone in and that person can instantly kind of latch into that identity. They can identify directors really easy because you've obviously can match up your identity with the output that the director is doing. Whereas some brands, you know, and I think this was especially true of Superdry, and I really loved this process, was they're looking for that identity, and in that case I think you definitely need something placed more long term, whether that be someone with their hand on the tiller or kind of as a creative director or a consultant or a director that can kind of push a series of content to really develop an identity. So it really does depend where the brand is, what I would recommend in terms of, you know, it's not a one size fits all process.
It's a good answer, Ryan. It's a good answer. I've talked a lot about this. It's a good, people are very confused about this issue. Agencies are constructing their infrastructure, and there are certain agencies out there that build to support in-house. I mean, there are cost benefits. I mean, I think the way I sit at the moment is there isn't a right answer, but the very, very most inspiring creative types that I've come across are free radicals, and they're out and about getting all sorts of exposure and experiences in the world, and then giving 1% of themselves to a project, which is then, you know, delivers well for a business. And then there's operational and administrative functions which kind of deliver it in-house.
Sorry, what's the kind of question from that? Sorry.
Well, there's just no question, but I think that's just a one-way piece of insight. But no, I just find it quite. I think what the future, where the future will come, will be this sort of, you know, this sort of jet stream of super talented folks that don't want to be specifically attached to any business, but can apply their magic dust to anything. And then there's a sort of administrative function and producing function that is brilliant in its own way, but perhaps is inside the business.
Oh yeah, 100%. Sorry. I agree with that completely. I think one of the things that's always in the kind of back of my mind, and a reason for coming out of Superdry and kind of linking up with Movidiam, was the opportunity to make sure I keep a broad scope of what I'm putting out there. I didn't want to become just a fashion filmmaker. I loved working in fashion, and it really excites me. It's probably closely linked to kind of performance music videos, because a lot of what you're doing is kind of less about a narrative and more about getting product in front of camera. Whereas, you know, I really, really love the narrative side of things. I like building these stories, however conceptual they might be. And that word free radicals, I really like that. I think that's a great term for discussion.
Patented. You're nice. More than welcome to use it. No, well, look, Ryan, it's been great having you. And just for anyone who's listening, who sort of understanding the sort of the Movidiam talent piece, Ryan is actually a represented director by Movidiam Talent. That's talent.movidiam.com. You can go and check out his profile there. And I look forward, Ryan, perhaps catching up in 3 or 4 months' time when we come back on the show and we can talk again. And any questions from the audience, please do fire them off to talent@movidiam.com on email, and we'll hook you up with Ryan. Ryan, absolutely fantastic having you on the show today. And what I particularly like, one of my favourite moments probably was the Alfred Hitchcock style creaking door as you had a guest's arrival.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, love it, Ryan. Absolutely brilliant. It's going to make it into the final cut. Brilliant, Ryan. Ever so much. Thanks for having you today. Have a great day.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
You've been listening to the Movidiam podcast. Movidiam is a world-class network of production talent complemented by secure tools that blend hiring, communication, and payments. Find out more at movidiam.com.